Hello everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of my video essay on Life is Strange 2. As we start episode 2, the timeline advances as it does every chapter. Sean and Daniel have discovered an abandoned cabin in the woods, which offers them shelter against the harsh winter. There, they collect clothing and stockpile supplies they'll need to survive. Much like the first episode in the woods, it offers them more time to bond while providing another beautiful backdrop to the story. The seasons, colors, locations, and little details that went in this game consistently blow my mind. And there's plenty of additional details you can discover of the in-between periods if you take a look at Sean's journal, which by the way was brilliantly illustrated by artist Elysian, who also illustrated Max's journal in the first Life is Strange game. As Sean further trains Daniel in the use of his powers, more opportunities to affect his behavior come in a variety of tough decisions. While letting him swear doesn't affect the story too much, it does set a precedent for good behavior when they arrive at the grandparents later, which again goes back to how people perceive the accused and people of color. Many of them go out of their way to present that safe, non-threatening image. And telling Daniel it's too dangerous to use his power is a big choice here, as it reinforces whether or not he'll use it indiscriminately later on, which has a direct effect on the endings of episode 2 and 3. It should be noted at this point that throughout the game, it's heavily implied that a lot of the choices boil down to either letting Daniel be his own person, or restricting him from using his powers. From a psychological standpoint, not only are those powers an important part of what makes Daniel himself, they also directly influence the rules both brothers live by. While it's certainly noble and imperative to want to shield him and Sean from being caught by the police or attacked by racists, you can't keep Daniel safe from himself all the time. So again, all your choices are in fact illusions and a delicate balancing act of cognitive dissonance. The title of this episode is aptly titled Rules for a reason, because it provides a brilliant stark contrast between the rules of the Diaz brothers, who live apart from society, and the rules of their grandparents, who live within society. Finding that balance proves to be no easy feat. When their dog, Mushroom, they rescued from the gas station is killed by a cougar, you have a choice between allowing Daniel to enact vengeance on the wild animal, or you can step forward and stop him. While on the one hand, Daniel's choice of vengeance here seems justified, the cougar was still a wild animal who probably just needed to feed its young. If he kills it, you get to bury Mushroom, which allows Daniel closure. But if you shoo it away with a stick, it drags the dog away. This is one of the first really difficult choices you have to make, because it does illustrate how following your own rules, killing the cougar, can lead to disastrous consequences and corrupt Daniel if you're not careful. Whereas society's rules, shooing the animal away, are unfair, because there's no justice or closure for the innocent, in this case, Mushroom. It serves as a perfect microcosm of the redemption and lone wolf endings, and even the American justice system as a whole. Sean at this juncture represents societal rules, and Daniel represents vigilantism. The white power structure in the US frequently enacts a corrupt, systemically racist form of justice. We shoo away the immigrants of our society, whom we've already made survival difficult for, and we don't value their differences. This choice is also an echo of the one you make in the first episode, where Esteban uses a simple Choco Crisp bar to illustrate a court proceeding. If you take it for yourself, Daniel gets angry, but let's just say it's for the best, since he eats 10 bags a week. If you give it to Daniel, he's happy, but the innocent one, Esteban, suffers. But if you give it to Esteban, he says, "I can't let you punish an innocent man," to which Sean replies, "I always knew you'd confess." Choices like this are microcosms of the game's 4 distinct endings, but again they illustrate how the US justice system works and whom it always favors. Families with 2 or more siblings often work in the same way. The young are always innocent, while the elder take the blame. Following Mushroom's burial and with Daniel sick, you progress to the home of Claire and Stephen Reynolds, the boys' grandparents. Again, this is just an absolutely beautiful cinematic montage of the boys' journey, backed by a song called Red by the aptly named artist Mount Wolf. Every single song in this game is memorable for me and was perfectly chosen. They just fit so well in the game's narrative, and it truly brings out the emotion of the Wolf Brothers story. I have to give Dontnod major credit for that, and they're just masterful storytellers in general. All of their emotional beats not only hit hard, they also feel very natural in the game's progression. It makes me feel something, and I wish I could say the same for Deck9's efforts with the franchise, but I'll save that topic for another video. Soon after entering the Reynolds house, Sean sips a mug of hot cocoa with Steven, up until Claire pulls him into the hall for a brief talk. It's hard to hear much of their conversation from the dining room, and there aren't subtitles, but if you listen very closely, you can hear Claire saying, "What if Sean really is a criminal, sleeping in our house, next to us?" When she returns, she offers to help the brothers so long as they abide by her rules, because as an elderly white retiree who spent most of her life in the Beaver Creek backwoods, it's safe to assume the Reynolds skew conservative and absorb far too much biased news to truly understand the brothers' situation. The conversation continues with some uncomfortable lines of questioning that hint at subtle racism. Among these are, "Why did you run away if you're innocent?" which again presumes guilt without evidence. If Sean raises his voice in protest, Steven admits we only know what we saw on the news, which also goes back to the media's ability to influence and skew public perception of the accused. Then there's, how can you take care of Daniel when you're both running from the police? But this begs the question, who else was supposed to care for Daniel? They had no other immediate family to turn to after the father was killed, because their mother left years prior. The police were the very reason Sean felt he needed to run, so this is obvious victim blaming. I suppose Claire and Steven could claim lack of information as their reason for being suspicious, and yet the boys aren't random strangers to them. They are their grandchildren. Sean is even said to have visited them at least once as a child, so it's not like they're strangers in any capacity. Neither of Claire's points are Sean's fault either, given the horrible hand he was dealt, and they imply that Sean had any choice in the matter. As a young man of color, he didn't, because again, the truth was never on his side from the start. The police as an institution claim the motto, "protect and serve," but when someone of color, or indeed anyone, is gunned down by an officer, the implied social contract is broken. Would you still trust the police if you had a loved one who was killed by them? Probably not. And again, given the socio-political climate of 2016, it's not hard to understand Shaw's mistrust of the system. When he brings up the point Daniel would end up in foster care, Steven replies, "You can't be sure." But Sean's concern is perfectly valid here, given that their mother abandoned them and Daniel was the only close family member he had left. Fear of the foster care system for Daniel is also valid, as in the United States, the foster system is known to suffer from overcrowding and does not always properly address the needs of the children, many of whom end up victims of abuse, get separated from their siblings, or flee from their foster homes. There's also Daniel's powers to consider. So Steven's downplaying of the issue is a form of psychological gaslighting meant to make Sean question his decisions, and it implies that he still had any manner of security left when they clearly didn't. Of course Sean couldn't be sure, but nothing up until now has been assured for the boys since they lost their father. He and Daniel are two homeless fugitives on the run from the law. They live apart from society, and they make their own rules as they go, and every choice causes cognitive dissonance. The only thing Sean can be sure of and stay true to is his promise to care and look after Daniel no matter what. As the boys settle into the Reynolds house amid tension, their relationship improves to a more familial tone 1 week later. Daniel enjoys bonding with his grandfather while Claire's demeanor has noticeably softened. But a conversation at the breakfast table proves she's still suspicious of the boys and where they came from. She cites things such as increased crime in the city, and when it comes to the question of the boy's mother, her daughter Karen, she keeps her old bedroom locked upstairs, preferring to avoid the subject altogether. Daniel is understandably curious about the mother he never knew, while Sean, having had plenty of memories with his mother before her departure, is much more jaded on the subject. Still, he knows Daniel deserves something of his mother. When he pushes the issue of the locked room, Claire claims there's no secret, and insists the boys follow her rules. If you tell her to chill out and Sean adds, "Relax, we're not criminals," she defends, "I didn't mean that," and the subject is dropped. So it would seem Sean's beginning to catch on to his grandmother's many coded meanings, and thus learning how best to use them as ammunition against her biased racial views. It reminds her in no small way that they are in fact family, not the criminals she suspects them of being. In some ways, this could also be viewed as a microcosm of American politics in general. The media and government constantly force us to pick sides and see each other as different, painting the opposition as evil, but that's simply not true to real life. In the end, we are far more than our politics, and when push comes to shove, most of us would save each other from a burning building. And yet doing so frequently demands we understand the layout of that building first, lest we all burn to the ground before anyone can be saved. I'm looking at you, Rachel Amber. When Claire sits down to read, Daniel wanders about to explore the living room, and Sean can talk further to Claire. She does express more veiled remarks relating to Esteban, claiming he did not try to build a bridge with them after Karen left. He was different, she says, and he never took a single step to change any of that. So it seems clear that she places some of the blame on Esteban for her daughter having left. It can also be insinuated from her remarks as well that Esteban was not a Christian, or at least not the type of devoted Christian she expected him to be. It should be noted that in the first episode, when you go down to the garage, a portrait of Christ can be seen on the upper wall, so we do know Esteban was a believer, at the very least. Regardless of Claire's obvious racism and stress over cultural differences, I do love this game for illustrating the conflict that often occurs within mixed-race families. The fact that Claire and Steven come to be welcoming to their grandchildren and go so far as to shield them from the police despite their initial reservations speaks much louder than their political affiliations. As you go about the house and tidy up, Claire thanks you for your cooperation in following the rules, and this also serves as a good example to Daniel, because later on when you ask him to clean the mess in the guest room, he might agree, provided you've also encouraged him to keep doing his homework to keep Claire off your backs and washed up in every restroom you've seen thus far. Sean then has a private conversation with Steven, who claims to have seen Daniel using his powers. I have to admit, I'm not yet sure of what the long-term effects of this choice are here, besides perhaps some dialogue changes later. If you check out the picture of Karen he has stashed on the printer, there's a nice moment of realism, where Steven says he likes to look at it and thinks of his daughter from time to time. Sean says he doesn't, but Steven understands and asks him not to tell Claire, which heavily implies that Steven snuck into the locked room at some point and kept the picture for himself. Again, this is just one of the many moments in the game I truly love for its emotional impact, because it shows how differently Claire and Steven are dealing with the loss of their daughter, after she cut ties with the family. The Reynolds are clearly a couple in pain. If Karen had died, that'd be one thing, but their grief is so complicated, so unresolved, they don't even know what to do with it. They just know that she's still alive and out there somewhere, and how do you even begin to make peace with something like that? You can't bury the living, much as Claire has tried to by locking up Karen's childhood room like a perpetual sarcophagus, leaving it just as untouched as the day Karen left. The scene hits so deep on so many levels. When the boys go out back for some well-deserved recreational time, they encounter the next-door neighbor, Chris Erickson. If you've played The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, you'll know Chris is the child who has suffered abuse at the hands of his alcoholic father. When Daniel saves Chris as the boy falls from the ladder of the treehouse, you're faced with not one, but two critical decisions. The first is acknowledging whether or not you saw him floating in midair when Chris asks if you saw it. Daniel pays attention to this. If you lie about seeing him, it'll affect whether or not Daniel tells the truth to Chris later on about his power. After an awkward interaction with Chris's dad, who carries the boy away on his back, Sean scolds Daniel. This one's actually not a hard choice. Reminding Daniel of your rules as a brother in this case falls into the conflict of brotherly rules doing more harm than good, and this goes back to what I was saying about the cognitive dissonance Sean faces. That's the thing we have to consider about this choice. After all, you're staying with the Reynolds, and what do the rules of the Reynolds represent? Society. Since you're back in civilization now, you have little choice but to follow society's rules for you. And besides that, reminding Daniel of the brotherly rules goes against a clearly defined human morality. I know it's cliche to say, but with great power comes great responsibility. If we have the power to step up and do the right thing by helping someone else, we should. Also, if you've allowed Daniel to use his powers up until now, you probably told him it was okay to use them as a last resort when you reminded him of the rules back at the cabin, so it's only fair to concede this time. The next day, Sean wakes up to find Daniel has gone over to the Ericksons' house, which openly challenges Claire's rules for the boys. I've heard a lot of gamers complain Daniel frequently does what he wants and sabotages Sean with this. But you have to consider that Daniel's a kid who has just had his first taste of comfortable life again with his grandparents. It makes perfect sense that he's happy to have met a boy his own age right next door, the first other kid his age he's seen in months. He wants to settle in and make friends because in truth, that's what he deserves as a child. I think part of the reason Sean might feel raw about it is selfishness, because he realizes deep down that he can never truly provide for Daniel what their grandparents have. He doesn't have a job, he doesn't have a house. All Sean has is the daydream of Puerto Lobos to carry them through. And while, yeah, they are supposed to be hiding out, his constant clinging to Daniel ends up being his ultimate foil. And that's toxic brotherhood, which is a point I'll examine in greater detail as we progress. It's something I haven't heard anyone else discuss. When you head off to Chris's house, Daniel's showing off with his powers, but Chris is convinced he's the one who has them. What you first say to them both isn't branded as an important choice, but it should be. This one directly affects the ending of the episode. You have the choice to lie again, and so again, Daniel is watching. If you tell Chris his newfound powers are cool, Daniel might lie to Chris later to preserve that secret. If you scold them both, Daniel's forced to be more responsible with his power. And that's important because once again, you're back in society, so following the brotherly rules can have disastrous consequences if you're not careful. Again, this isn't fair, but neither is most of the game. The boys all head to the Christmas market to pick out a tree for Chris, and Sean pulls Daniel aside. You can either protect the secret of his powers, or encourage him to stop lying. This is another cognitively dissonant choice that pits societal rules against brotherly. But this one is actually misleading because the brotherly choice comes off as protective one, and the societal choice seems reckless. Trusting Daniel to tell the truth also means placing your trust in Chris, who is an outside party. And I get it, it feels dangerous. However, in this case, encountering Chris ends up being a good thing, provided you make the right choices with his dad later, which I'll go over shortly. While the boys play and look for a tree, Sean browses around for a Christmas present to give to Daniel and meets Cassidy, the purple-dreaded hippie busker. This is another nice human interaction I love in this game. You can listen to her song for a bit, and it's one of those many beautiful, immersive moments. Her friend Finn shows up to meet with her and leave, and they have a brief spat with a conservative, bearded man at the market. What the game doesn't tell you, but that exploring the assets in the file system does, is that the bearded man is actually Nick, one of Chris's dad's friends, who also happens to be the deputy of the local police force. It's implied that he later squeals on Sean and Daniel's presence because it's the sheriff who shows up at the Reynolds house. If you play through the Captain Spirit game, it reveals that Charles hired private investigators to find out who may have killed his wife in a hit-and-run accident, because the local police weren't helpful and the paper trail ended. It's heavily implied that perhaps Nick either had something to do with Chris's mother's death, or at the very least he was involved in covering it up somehow, which really does add a whole new layer of holy shit. Anyway, the boys head home and Sean has a conversation with Charles. If you got Chris to open up to you about his dad's problems, Charles pledges to seek help for his alcoholism. So Daniel going over to Chris's house ends up working out for the best. As we enter the Reynolds house, Daniel reveals whether or not he told Chris the truth. If he says yeah and changes the subject, he lied. But if he adds he was disappointed, you'll know he told the truth. And this will definitely get you the good ending. The Diaz boys finally explore Karen's old room, and before that you have a chance to look at the grandparents' room too. Again, I can't say enough good things about the extensive level of detail that went into this game. Every object and photo tells a backstory in itself, and further highlights what their strained family dynamic has been like over time. Claire keeps her daughter's baby teeth in a little box in their bedroom, while Karen's room remains a perfectly preserved shrine of childhood memory, as if her wayward teenage daughter is going to come back to it someday, not having aged for all those years. It's very sad and a little pathetic, but also beautiful in its own way. It is here that the brothers find their mother's letter Claire has kept hidden from them. Suddenly, everything comes crashing down as they realize their mother has been looking for them. Claire and Stephen return from church to find them in the room. At this point, it almost seems like Claire set the room as a trap. Maybe she deliberately put the letter in there just to see if the brothers would break in and prove her racist views right. Though I'm not sure she'd even have that kind of foresight or ill intention, it's just something I thought about as a possibility. Claire comes down hard and fast about the rules again, and this is actually a smart illustration of how their family conflict intersects with racism. It's interesting to me how those intersections actually start to accumulate throughout the episodes too. Claire obviously didn't approve of her daughter running off on her own and marrying a Mexican man, so seeing Sean and Daniel break into the room is both exacerbating her deep-rooted racial fears, as well as reminding her of what she feels is the ultimate mistake Karen made. It's worth pointing out here that white women play a role in upholding the nuclear family. What pisses her off most is that her daughter openly rejected that role. And while I do think that Claire cares for Sean and Daniel a lot as her grandchildren, she does come off as one of those conservative white women raised in the same town her entire life. So she has a lot of inner conflict to work through before she can finally accept the boys as full-fledged members of her family. When Sean brings up the point his mother probably left because she couldn't deal with the rules anymore, Claire goes ballistic because again, Sean has learned how to push her buttons. But they're interrupted by the cabinet falling on Stephen downstairs. On the one hand, I'd love to have seen where the rest of that conversation led, but let's face it, the game needed to ratchet up some tension after those long periods of exploration. After pulling Stephen out from under the cabinet and the police show up, Claire at last feels regretful of how she treated the boys all along. Because going back to what I outlined before, we are not our political or cultural differences, and Americans are just people when it comes down to it. And with the cabinet falling on Stephen and considering the prior conversation, it would seem we've mastered the layout of that burning building once and for all, as Claire finally tells the boys she loves them and distracts the sheriff so they can get away. It's a very sad, emotional moment that highlights just how far their family has come in such a short time, and how the Reynolds have been impacted by their grandchildren's visit. This is something I feel is also very telling, given our political climate from 2016 up until the present. When people are more isolated, either by their internet addiction, by living in rural or backwoods areas their whole lives with less resources, transit options, or modern conveniences, as opposed to urban and suburban communities which foster more connection, it's common to see community and identity in groups that shun major differences. And sometimes, all it takes is one positive experience, trading stories or sharing space with an outsider to shift your perspective. This kind of story is also common for those who have left white supremacist groups thanks to organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center. Shirley Phelps Roper has a similar story after having left the cult of the Westboro Baptist Church. As the saying goes, kill them with kindness. Or, since this is Life is Strange, be kind. Rewind. Sorry, I had to. Anyway, depending on your choices thus far, Sean and Daniel will either skip Chris's yard to the street, or see Chris hanging out on the swing in his yard. With the former, he'll either run into the street and get hit by a cop car, or Daniel will move the car to protect Chris. With the latter, Chris guides them to a shortcut to escape through the woods. In the final scene, the brothers wait for a train to arrive near the Beaver Creek waterfront, where we begin to understand how our choices affected Daniel. It's revealing either way, but not too revealing, and I love how it appeals to the emotions of the player. You'll either feel satisfied with the decisions or regretful with him. For better or worse, Daniel is growing, and we as players must grow with him. As the train arrives, the brothers head off to unknown horizons as the First Aid Kit song I Found a Way fades in, recalling Cassidy's song at the Christmas market and the fragile, fleeting hope we carry within us. And that concludes part 2 of this video essay. Again, I hope you enjoyed this segment and that it wasn't too long, even though it was a bitch to read, but... And I don't know if this is a common problem that affects everybody, but after I've been reading for a while, my tongue gets all twisted and I can't talk for shit, so don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you, I appreciate you, and I will see you on the next episode.